In the last section, I showed you how I had multiple terminal windows open, and between the different terminal windows, I had reconfigured my copy of Docker client. And so in this section, I'm going to show you how you can do the same thing, and then we'll talk a little bit about why you would want to do this at all. All right, so here's what we're going to do. Anytime that you want to configure your local copy of the Docker CLI, remember, that's the thing that we are accessing inside of our terminal. This is Docker CLI right here. If you want to reconfigure your copy of Docker CLI to communicate with a copy of Docker server inside of the virtual machine, we're going to run this command right here. So I'm going to copy that command. I'm going to go over to a new terminal window. And over here, when I do a Docker PS, you'll see that I am clearly connected to my local copy of Docker server. Now I'm going to run that command right there. I'll leave it on the screen so you can read it. You can type it inside of your terminal if you want to. So when I run this command right here, it's going to very temporarily reconfigure my copy of Docker client or Docker CLI to connect to the Docker server inside of my Kubernetes node. So after running that command, I can now do a Docker PS, and I'll see the print up from all the different containers that are running inside of my virtual machine. Now, quick note here, and this is an extremely important thing to understand. Anytime that you run that eval command right there, it is a very temporary reconfiguration of your Docker CLI. So when you run this command, it's only going to reconfigure your Docker CLI in your current terminal window. What that means is, right here, if I do a Docker PS, I clearly am working with the reconfigured version of the Docker client, but as soon as I open up a new terminal window, it goes back to its old behavior. So when you run that command, two things to be aware of. First off, it is not a permanent change. You're not permanently reconfiguring your copy of Docker client. The other thing to remember is that if you decide to close down your terminal window, maybe you take a break from Docker or something like that, or you turn off your computer and close all the programs running on it. If for whatever reason you close that terminal window, you have to rerun this command right here to reconfigure your Docker CLI again. All right, so just to really make sure that's very clear, I'm going to show you one more time. I know this is getting a little bit repetitive, but I can just about guarantee you that at some point in time, you're going to run Docker PS and say, hey, wait, why am I not seeing everything inside of the virtual machine? So when I run that command and do a Docker PS, I see everything inside of the virtual machine. As soon as I open up a new terminal window and do a Docker PS again, back to old behavior. So throughout the rest of this course, if I ever say to you, hey, let's see what Docker inside the virtual machine is doing, you need to make sure that you first run that command right there. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to look inside of the virtual machine and figure out what the copy of Docker inside there is doing. Now, just in case you're curious about what exactly this command right here is doing, you can actually take just the minikube docker env command right there and run it by itself. When you do so, you'll see that it's actually just exporting a couple of environment variables. So just so you know, whenever you use a Docker CLI command, like say Docker PS right here, when Docker is invoked, it's going to look at a set of environment variables to decide what copy of Docker server it is supposed to connect to and attempt to execute this command on. So when we run this minikube docker env command, with the eval command especially, it's going to set up some new environment variables that are going to tell Docker CLI to reach into the virtual machine to find the copy of Docker server that is supposed to work with. And if you look at this Docker host variable right here, you might even be able to recognize the IP address. It's actually the IP address of your minikube server. For example, if you do minikube IP right now, you'll see it prints out the identical IP address to what we're telling the Docker client to attempt to connect to. All right. Now, one last thing I want to mention here, it's kind of hard to remember this entire command by itself. It's kind of hard to remember this and have to recall it at some point in the future when you want to reconfigure your shell. I found that a very easy way to remember this command is to instead memorize the command minikube docker env by itself. Remember, that's what we just ran 2 seconds ago to print out all those environment variables. When you run just minikube docker env by itself, it will actually tell you, hey, if you want to configure your shell, or essentially your current terminal window, here's what you need to run. And it's the full-length command with the eval on there as well. So a very easy way of memorizing how to do this is not to memorize the eval part, just memorize minikube docker env. That's all you have to remember. And as long as you can remember that, type that in, and then it will tell you exactly what to type right here. So you can copy paste that in, and boom, you're good to go. All right, so that is what is going on when we run that docker ps and see a listing of all the containers inside the virtual machine. Now, the very last thing I want to tell you is why we would want to do this, right? Why would we ever want to look at the copy of Docker running inside of the virtual machine? Especially since I told you when we first started looking at Kubernetes that you and I, as developers, do not mess around with the inner workings of the virtual machine. Remember, I told you we don't mess around with the virtual machine ourselves. We leave it up to the master to change the configuration of the virtual machine or change the different containers running inside there. So let's take a quick pause right now. When we come back to the next section, we'll talk about why we might want to reach into this thing and inspect the different containers that are running and kind of mess around with them a little bit. All right, so quick pause, and I'll see you in just a minute.